One of the policy dimensions that we look at is the rejection of multilateral institutions. In the current crisis, we just saw a very clear case of a rejection of a multilateral institutions in President Trump saying that he was not going to fund the World Health Organization. Right there, an example and an expression of economic nationalism in the works as the epidemic develops. Trade on medical equipment, the sort of protectionism and other policies that are being put in place to stem trade of medical equipment in the world. And the kind of fallout that that's going to have for everybody because it's going to affect every country. So these sorts of things we're seeing more and more of, and not to speak of Orban and what he's done in Hungary in terms of grabbing power, establishing sort of an autocratic system. So we have a whole range of actions here that we've seen across the world, which tell us this very clear story that, the current wave of nationalism is highly opportunistic and is using the epidemic as a platform. I would say that no. In the middle of an epidemic, it is extremely difficult to move certain leaders away from the positions that they're taking. In the short term, we don't have a lot of room to move the situation. But as time goes by, that will happen in the course of elections. One thing that we're already seeing, and we see it everywhere, is that as a result of the epidemic and the economic fallout and everything else, a lot of leaders, including a lot of these nationalist leaders, while they are having sort of an opportune moment, at the same time, they're facing a lot of challenges going forward because obviously, the death toll, the numbers of the epidemic, the economic fallout, all of that ultimately is in the hands of the incumbents, so to speak, whether they be nationalists or non nationalists. And so I think one thing that will be very interesting to see is moving forward as countries have elections. What are we going to see? Are voters going to, put the blame where blame should be put in places where we haven't seen the right response? And if that happens, will we see a change in this economic nationalist ways? So if we want to go by the history, there's a long narrative that, tells us that these things simply don't work. It's an unsustainable model because at the end of the day, you either mess up your macroeconomy completely or, or you fall into a situation where suddenly you just stop growing at the rate you were growing before because you exhaust the capacity of the economy to really sort of keep those policies going. But then if we just want to go with, okay, fine, that's not going to convince a lot of people. Well, the current circumstances, I think, will end up convincing some people at least, because the situation is one where, after we get out of this epidemic and whatever way we get out of it, there will be a reconstruction effort everywhere because economies will have suffered significantly, and that reconstruction effort simply can't happen without coordination and without global cooperation. This is kind of the lesson we learned after World War II, when many countries were still very nationalist, and yet they had to come together for reconstruction. So I think, ultimately, we may be going through this period where we see the opportunism and nationalism rise, but as we get further out into sort of some exit, that is pragmatically going to have to fall by the wayside.